finally then, we can move then to maybe questions and answers. And back to Paul.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Fran, and also to Ted for that earlier outline on the overall approach on the strategic plan and what we're looking at in terms of the combination of interventions. So I see there have been lots of questions coming in over the course of the presentations, and we did get some questions in advance of this evening as well. So what I propose to do is try and pick up on the questions that are coming in. I might just start with one or two questions which actually are reflected now in the list that have come in, which have also featured in some of the contacts with the department in the lead up to this evening. And I was going to start maybe by just putting one or two questions to colleagues on a couple of those questions. A couple of questions have come in relation to active farmer and what the department is thinking in relation to the definition of active farmer in the context of what's been agreed under the regulations. And there's also been one or two questions around eligibility, land eligibility, and what the department's approach would be to land eligibility in the future, including in relation to scrubland, for instance, and previous issues around the eligibility of that type of land under the basic payment scheme. So if I could, I was going to just go to my colleague from Portlaoise, Thomas Harty, to maybe give a response. First of all, Thomas, maybe on the active farmer piece in terms of what the scope is there, if you like, within the regulations and where the thinking might be on that. And maybe again, looking for particular input from people as far as the consultation is concerned. And then secondly, on that eligibility piece and where that is heading at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Paul, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. So yeah, as Paula said, I'll take the active farmer questions. We've had some before tonight, and I see tonight there have been a number of questions all around the same area. Basically, what are the criteria for an active farmer? As Paul and Fran and Ted have already outlined, so the idea is to get your views on this as much as us telling you our current thinking. As it stands, what the regulations are saying is that active farmers must be someone who is engaged in at least a minimum level of agricultural activity. So the current thinking we have is that we will look to get confirmation from applicants under the BIS that they themselves are whoever's declaring the land are the ones taking the agricultural and economic risk with regard to the activity being undertaken. What that means for most farmers is that, for example, if you're a grassland farmer, that there would be automated checks carried out by the department where cross-checks our systems will be able to confirm, for example, you have livestock and hence that's how you're maintaining the land. And for those farmers where it's not clear from our systems by what mechanism they themselves are carrying out the activity and carrying the economic risk, we would then have to engage with those farmers and ask them to provide the relevant evidence, just to show again how they themselves are again taking that economic risk and carrying out the agricultural activity themselves. So I suppose to give a practical example of that, there are obviously farmers out there with grassland who make hay and silage to sell. That's absolutely legitimate agricultural activity. And in those circumstances, we would just want to see some evidence of that that going on. And I suppose what we're looking to try and identify with the active farmer, though, is maybe situations where the farmer themselves declaring the land is not the one taking the economic risk in terms of the activity. So as it stands, that's the direction, I suppose, of travel that we have and our thinking on the active farmer. And the aim, I suppose, in a lot of things that we hope to do with it is, in as much as possible, to use our own systems to be able to make that determination, and then only to ask questions of those where it's not immediately obvious as to how they themselves are, again, that term, carrying out the agricultural activity and taking the economic risk. So that's, I suppose, the broad outline of the active farmer. The second point that Paul's mentioned that I'm going to maybe just cover briefly is what's known as the eligible hectare. And you'll have seen from particularly Fran's presentation, all the major payments are based on area-based payments and all require the farmer to have an eligible hectare. I'll address in a second maybe some of the changes, but just for everyone, while there are changes and very positive changes that we're proposing, the basics of what meets the conditions of eligibility are very much the same, or the proposals are the same as what we currently have. And that's the farmer must have an agricultural area, and they must carry out an agricultural activity, or there must be an agricultural activity on that land. So for most farmers, that is an agricultural area. In Ireland, we're predominantly grassland, so that's permanent grassland, and the majority of farmers' activity is grazing livestock or mechanical control, topping, mowing, mulching. So that broad definition of eligibility stays the same. We had a specific question, I suppose, today or before the meeting today, which was querying maybe circumstances where a farmer had what they class maybe as marshy type land that they hadn't put in the past, and we're wondering where that land fits in the new cap. So what I would say is that, again, as I've just outlined, the basic definition is the same. It must be an agricultural area, must be able to grow grass, and then you must be able to carry out an activity. So in terms of marshy land specifically, you know, it must be possible carrying livestock. It must be that obviously there must be an activity on it, but in the first instance, the land is capable of supporting livestock and livestock use. And in that situation, then, you know, that type of land is, you know, could be and can be deemed eligible if put forward for payment. This was the second part of that question, and it touches on the sort of one of the major changes that we're proposing is the scrubby land. So if there is scrub within land, as it currently stands, scrub is not eligible for the vast majority of situations. So our proposal is that up to 30% of a parcel can consist of features beneficial to the climate and environment, scrub, you know, groves of trees, for example, and that these areas could be paid on and would be part of the eligible hectare. So that broadening of the definition is something that I think, and I know Ted touched on it a bit earlier on, trying to align the first and second pillar. So acknowledging the importance of areas such as scrub on holdings, and having payments, farmers can then declare those areas and they become eligible under the BIS scheme going forward, and under area-based schemes that would be available for payment. So the main one, again, is that 30% proposal. There are two other ones I think that are important to point out. The idea that, as I said, for land to be eligible, there must be an agricultural area and an activity. In the new cap, there is scope, and our proposal would be that in duly justified circumstances, that activity may only happen every second year. And that may perhaps be a situation where, you know, there are, for very good and environmental reasons, or for the habitat, the grassland habitat, it may be the right thing to do not to, for example, use land 1 year, but only every second year. So there is that potential, and we see that having an important role on some of maybe the more extensive grasslands. The other one, just to point out, that is there in terms of proposal and changes, so is that on any land that would be converted to agriculture in future, but that conversion would have come about and led to some damage of a habitat, could not be considered eligible in future. So that's probably, if you want to call it, on the flip side of it, land that, you know, if someone has done damage to create an agricultural area, that land cannot be considered part of the eligible hectare that the farmer would put forward. So yeah, broadly, the main function of the eligible hectare is the same, an ag area with an ag activity, but the important changes, and I think the very positive changes in terms of recognizing the importance of a wider area, is the 30% that we would consider as being eligible, and the idea of the agricultural activity existing every second year. So that's the proposal we aim to take to DG Agri, but we would obviously, as we're going to probably keep saying tonight, welcome any observations or comments that others may have on it. So that's the broad outline, I think, and the answer to the major points that were raised beforehand, and maybe tonight I've covered there. So I'll pass it back to you there, Paul.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Thomas. And I think there were a couple of other comments or questions on the messages that came in there around that active farmer piece as well, around which I think you kind of dealt with a couple of questions around armchair farmers, about whether there is, if you like, negative activities or negative lists such as airports, etc., which I think is a feature already of our current system in terms of identifying active farmers, and will be facilitated, I think, as part of our approach in the new CAP as well, I think, in terms of incorporating a negative list as well as defined in the context of agricultural activity. So I think those elements have been responded to, I think. Sorry, just before I go on and respond to some of the other questions that have been coming in, just to make the point that one or two contributors have made the point about not taking questions verbally this evening on the format that we're operating, that kind of the town hall format in webinar structure. But that's essentially, we've gone with the webinar function partly for technical and practical reasons, I suppose, to try and maximize the number of participants that we can have in the webinar context, which wouldn't really be possible, I think, technically in terms of using a WebEx or a Zoom function, because we have capacity for up to a couple of thousand participants in these town hall meetings. So the way we've structured this evening's proceedings and for the next two evenings is to take questions and comments from people in writing, which are directed in centrally, and we're picking up on those as we go through here this evening, as I pick them up and get colleagues to respond, and we will, like I say, follow up further afterwards and pick up on some of these issues perhaps again over the next two evenings as they come up as well. So I know there isn't the same chance for interaction or discussion, but we know there's a lot of feedback coming to us on foot of the consultation exercise having begun. We do want to take people's questions and comments, and like I say, for practical and for technical reasons, this was the best format. So apologies, I know if you were expecting to be able to interact or exchange, but this is a much better way to deal with a much larger number of questions from a technical point of view, from our perspective as well. But we will try and answer all of the questions that are coming in. So just on that point, I'd also mention I think there was one certainly question earlier on that came in relation to budget allocations, that budget allocations are not included against schemes in the consultation document. Yes, that is the case, because those budgetary allocations have not yet been agreed. There's still some discussion going on between ourselves and the Department of Agriculture and with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. As soon as we have agreement on those and a clear structure around those, we'll be able to fill in those details for people. So we will be able to do that at a later point, and we hope to do that very soon. But for the moment, we've gone with the interventions without particular funding allocations where they involve, in particular, national co-financing. And there's one other question, I think, just that I might just pick up on at the moment, which came in around, I think, around the relationship, I think, between eco schemes and the EAFRD funding. It was specifically around the 25% related to EAFRD, or whether there was any link between the 25% for eco schemes in Pillar 1 and rural development. And I think that question might have been picking up on the point in the consultation document that while member states have to have a minimum of 25% of direct payments allocated to eco schemes, they can adjust that depending on the volume of expenditure above 30% that they spend on environmental programs, environmental measures under Pillar 2. So that is an option that is under consideration, but it is a provision that's in the regulations in relation to that, if you like, linkage between what is spent in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 on environmental activities. So just to cover those couple of points. I'm going to pick up maybe on a few other questions that have come in and ask colleagues to come in on those. I've seen quite a few questions here so far in relation to the Suckler Carbon Efficiency Program, a number of questions around the limit in terms of number of suckler animals that people can hold, not to allow the limit to be increased. Also a couple of questions in relation to the reference year and what that impact that might have more generally on people's participation in the scheme. So I wonder, could I ask, perhaps, I know Val Woods is on the call and also Maria Dunn from our Meat Milk Policy Division. So I don't know, Val or Maria, do you want to come in with any comments in terms of what the overall approach is, if you like, on the Suckler Carbon Efficiency Program, why the numbers are being limited, I suppose, and kind of the nature of the scheme in terms of its nature compared to other types of schemes?
Hi, Paul, and evening, everybody. I'm happy to come in on those. I'm Val Woods, as Paul mentioned, from the Meat and Milk Policy Division. I suppose just in relation to the cap in numbers, just to explain the rationale behind that, it's not about seeking to reduce production or reduce numbers. The rationale is that, and Ted touched on it in his presentation, while the measures within the scheme will reduce emissions or will help reduce emissions in the cows overall, in suckler cows, there is a danger, I suppose, that could be offset or even negated by allowing increased production. So it's just to safeguard against that. And I suppose it's important to reiterate the point that Ted made about the fact that this is fundamentally an environmental scheme. People are who sign up to go into it are being asked to cap their numbers for that reason, because one of the core objectives, I suppose, is to reduce emissions. And sorry, Paul, there was another question in relation to the reference year, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so look, in terms of the reference here, obviously that hasn't been determined yet, and we're interested in taking people's views on what that would look like. But I suppose internally, the thinking that we are currently, the lines that we're currently thinking along is, I suppose, in terms of taking an average of a number of years. And that's in the interest of fairness, I suppose, to people who may have participated in BEAM and reduced as a result of that, or maybe have been subject to TB restrictions or other management issues. So that's kind of what we're thinking. But again, happy to and very interested in this meeting's views on how that should look. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Val. And maybe just on a related question, again, a couple of questions have come in this area, both I think on as far as the suckler scheme is concerned, but also on the sheep side around participation in quality assurance schemes as well, about why that particular provision is there. And maybe, I don't know if you could maybe comment on that from a suckler point of view, and maybe James Walsh might be on the department on the sheep scheme. You pick up on that point as well, and there are 2 other points on sheep scheme that I can come to then.
Sure. Well, actually, just in relation to the sheep scheme, I suppose the rationale for the inclusion of the requirement, eligibility requirement of S-Plus membership is that I suppose quality assured stock is a prerequisite for some European markets currently. It's becoming an increasingly important market tool, I suppose. Currently, we don't produce enough QA stock in the sheep sector to provide consistent supply across the year. So it's in the interest, I suppose, of developing and maintaining markets. QA assurance is going to be, certification, sorry, is going to be increasingly important in all livestock markets, particularly in sheep. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, thanks for that, Val. I'm not sure.
Thanks.
James, want to add anything on that?
Paul, yes, James Walsh here from the Sheep Welfare Scheme and Direct Payments Division. No, Paul, Valerie covered that there, so I have nothing further to add to that.
Okay, thanks, James. There were 1 or 2 other comments there, I think, in relation to RAM genotyping as well, and a couple of the comments that come in around that, the impact of that, or what effect that might have on people's eligibility for the scheme. So I don't know, do you want to maybe explain the rationale for the RAM genotyping provision in that scheme?
Well, I didn't see that question, Paul, but generally the genotyping RAM is to basically improve the health and the well-being of the flock. The genotype RAM 4 or 5-star breeding rams, when they're bred with yields, they produce fitter, healthier lambs essentially, and that's the objective of the scheme, to improve the overall welfare of the flock, of the Irish sheep flock, and that's the idea of using the 4 or 5-star genotype RAM in the sheep improvement scheme when it comes into being.
Okay, thanks, James. I'm going to move on. There were a couple of questions also in relation to on young farmers. I know there were a few comments, I think, just on the threads that have come in. Again, more kind of comments really rather than particular questions. So I think we'll take the comments on board that we're getting in, and we'll reflect on those as we move ahead with the consultation exercise. So I'm not proposing to necessarily respond to every comment, but we have those, and we will pick up on those and follow up on them in due course. But there were a couple of maybe more particular points around the complementary income support for young farmers, whether that was similar to installation aid, I think was one that was asked. Fran, maybe you might be able to just clarify that or make the distinction between the 2 things. And the second one, I think, just maybe while you're answering that, there was certainly one, at least possibly a couple of questions there around whether there would still be trading of entitlements under the new system. Given the changes that are coming under direct payments, will the trading of entitlements still feature as part of that? So maybe could you pick up on those couple of points?
Okay, so taking the new young farmer scheme first. So no, it's not the same as installation aid. It's much more that it's a successor to the good work already done by the current young farmer scheme. So it'd be a similar basis. The change though that's there is that at the moment the Young Farmer Scheme is paid as a top-up per entitlement. So if you own 20 entitlements, you'll get a top-up on your 20 entitlements. If you own 40 entitlements, you get your top-up on the 40 entitlements. The same amount on each entitlement, more of them. In the new scheme, that is going to change, and we have a choice to make whether we pay that per eligible hectare, so not linked to entitlements, or whether we pay a flat sum every year. So there are some choices in that for us. But the same entry criteria, more or less, we think will apply. So the education, the age, and so on, as it is at the moment. And we also think that the payment period will be similar to what it is at the moment, of 5 years. And we also believe that there will be continuity for any young farmer who has started this year or next year, or over the last year or so. They will be able to pretty much seamlessly continue on into the new cap as well. So if you think of it in terms of the same people get paid the new money, whatever that might end up being. So I hope I know someone along the way had asked about what age for young farmers. So 40 is still the default age that's there. We don't see that changing. It is possible to go younger, but it's likely, we think, to be 40. I think that probably answers that question, Paul. Trading of entitlements, then.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just saying, yeah, trading on entitlements, if you could deal with that. So
yes, for whether you like trading of entitlements or you don't like trading of entitlements as a farmer, the agreement is clear. We must provide trading of entitlements for farmers going into the future. So absolutely, there will be trading of entitlements in the future. It's important at this point for me to say to you that the value of entitlements absolutely is going to change. There's little doubt about that in 2023. And just like you would have gotten a notification from us at the start of this year saying what value your entitlements were this year, we will be doing that when we move towards the new cap as well. So you will get that notification of the value of your entitlements. Again, we must provide that to you. It's not something we have a choice in anyways, and of course it's useful. But as we move in and as the value of your entitlements change, you as a business person and looking after your own business, you need to know that that value will change. So if you're setting out on a lease of entitlements for several years, or whether you're renting out or renting in, or you're selling, or whatever you're doing with your entitlements, you have to know that in new cap, they will change. That value will change. And you will be well advised to build some allowance for that into whatever contracts you're putting in place. So it's important just that everybody knows that. We've said this quite a few times, and I know that you probably only think about these things as you come closer and you're actually making the decision, but it's important for you to know that. So I see a question there about people trading up entitlements or not, or selling trading entitlements of different values. So just as I said at the start, that the fund that entitlements will be allocated from starts to shrink. And as we get closer to that minimum of 85% mark, the variation of value of entitlements, of individual entitlements, that band will narrow quite a bit. So there won't be the same variation in the unit values that you might have seen historically. So just wanted to say that just for clarity for everyone. We would welcome any of your thoughts on any of those things, of course.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that, Fran. There was one other point. I think another question that came up earlier was around, I think, partnerships, or how partnerships might be affected by convergence and the operation of, or sorry, the movement of payments and the kind of the general move as we've seen on convergence over the last number of years, and to what extent partnerships will be affected by that. I presume, again, in the context of continuing the convergence process as previously, albeit at a different rate, that the treatment of partnerships continues in the same way in the future, essentially, as has been the case up until now.
Yeah, in essence, convergence is blind to what type of farm structure holds those entitlements. Convergence will carry on. So whether you own the same 32 entitlements that you had in 2015, or whether you own 10 and if you rented in 50, each of those different sets of entitlements will carry on under convergence as you trade them, as you bring them in, as you get them out. They will all continue on their path that will be set out for them across the next cap. So whether it's a partnership, a limited company, whether it's you know, an individual farmer, whatever it might be, convergence will still apply across those entitlements in the same way.
Okay, thanks, Fran. I'm going to move now to a couple of questions. We've had a few questions coming in around eco schemes, including around things like payment structure, whether payments will cover costs, what the situation is in terms of impact on incomes potentially, I think around organics, and also around things like creating ponds and water courses and other things, whether those kinds of activities would be eligible as eco scheme activities. So obviously there's work going on in relation to development of eco schemes. So I might ask my colleague David Buckley in Portlaoise, who's overseeing that work now, to maybe comment. David, I'm not sure if you've seen those questions that have come in, or I think as a general flavour, that's kind of the range of issues that people have raised in terms of the level of the eco scheme payment, what might be included in eco schemes, and what are the measures that are currently being considered by the department as eco scheme eligible, if you like.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Good afternoon or good evening to everyone. Yeah, I just saw one or two of the questions that came in there. I suppose there was one question, first of all, and it's a very pertinent question. If we want to incentivize farmers into an eco scheme, we need to make sure that bottom line there's something for the farmer out of them. So certainly, and as Ted would have pointed out, first and foremost, we want farmers to participate in an eco scheme. As Fran has in his modelling document, at 25%, we're looking at just short of 300 million. So we absolutely want to make sure that we design a scheme that farmers want to participate in first and foremost. So therefore, there has to be something out of it for the farmer. And secondly, then, and clearly, that it also delivers for the environment. So that's our overall objective first and foremost. That's the first thing. And I suppose what goes with it too is we therefore then need to make sure that the scheme administratively is as easy as possible for a farmer and farmers to apply for, and equally so for, and to be blunt about it, for the department to administer and therefore to get payments out within the year. So the intention is that the farmer will apply for their eco as part of the BIS application on an annual basis from 2023 on. So in much the same way that a farmer submits their BPS at the moment, and maybe if they're in GLAS as well, they're submitting their payment details there, they will do exactly the same for eco. So in terms of the likely money, so if as Fran has outlined in the modelling document, you're looking at 297 million. If you divided that by all eligible hectares, so if every farmer currently on every eligible hectare participated, then you're looking at a payment rate of around 64 euros a hectare. So we are in the middle of designing the interventions or the actions that will make up an eco scheme. So we're certainly very happy to get people's feedback and suggestions, which Paul has already outlined will be from between now and the next number of weeks. So we're very happy to get them. What I would say is from the perspective of making sure that the scheme is as easy as possible for farmers to implement, to take up, we don't envisage having a massive list of actions, because that just introduces the complexity for farmers in taking actions and for the department in making sure that we administer and ultimately pay farmers for the work. So we certainly want to ensure that the actions farmers are taking up are relevant and pertinent to their holding. We do not want farmers ticking a box, so to speak, as part of their BIS application, selecting an eco scheme action that they could never within the year achieve, whatever that may well be. So in essence, we want to ensure that we present whatever the eco scheme actions are relevant to the particular cohort of farmers. So if you're a livestock farmer and only livestock for argument's sake, then there's no reason for you really to see tillage, and vice versa. If you're a tillage with perhaps no livestock, we don't want to lead farmers into potentially non-compliance or penalty situations. The only other, I suppose, point to make is, so the Article 28 of the CSP Reg, which sets out the eco-scheme actions, it's very clear. So payments are going to be on eligible hectares that both Thomas and Ted and others have touched on. We certainly, within it, there's two ways of doing the costings, and 28.6b is around income forgone and costs incurred. So in essence, very similar to the way ACMs will be, and GLOS was in the past costed. So we need to make sure, and just to reiterate, we need to make sure there is something in it for the farmer, because we do ultimately want farmers to participate. It's of no benefit to the environment or for the potential fund of 300 million if we do not get farmers to participate. So maybe just to allay people's fears around that. And secondly, we are in the midst of developing actions, and we'll be obviously bringing that to a conclusion over the coming weeks and the next month or 6 weeks. We'd be very happy, Paul, to get people's feedback over the course of this in terms of what they consider should be suitable actions. I'll hand back to yourself, Paul, if there's anything else that I've missed.
No, thanks. No, thanks for that, Damon. David, that's good for the moment. I think we might return to that a bit later, but just I'd like to, there were a few questions I think have come in around some of the conditionality points as well, or conditionality elements. For instance, and they were kind of touched on a little bit earlier, one or two, I think, on GAEC, for instance, in terms of the mandatory change of crop in each parcel every year, which came in earlier from one contributor. And also, I think, a couple of questions around definition of peatlands and wetlands and what the situation is there around GAEC too. So maybe could I ask, I think colleagues, David Ryan, I think, is on the call. I'm not sure if Tom Keating's on the call, but I think David is. So maybe, David, do you want to maybe explain what the overall thrust is from the point of view of GAEC and the scope within the regulation for flexibility there around how member states implement that? And then maybe just to touch on GAEC 2 and I suppose the treatment of wetlands and peatlands in a general sense.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Just on GAEC 8, I see a few questions have come in. Concerns around, I suppose, crop rotation and the view that it's a change in the crop in the parcel every year. So look, that's in the text, but also in the footnote in the text, it allows member states to decide other rules if they can be duly justified. And look, crop diversification is in that, so we're going to, what we're proposing, our thinking is that we'll continue with our crop diversification, our 2-crop and our 3-crop rules. We'll have to make a case to the Commission in terms of the reasons why we believe this is meeting the objectives of the GAEC 8 standards. So we are fairly confident that that's the case. In terms of we feel that crop diversification offers more flexibility for our farmers. In terms of the structure, we're kind of unique in terms of Europe, that we have quite a small arable sector, so we want to protect that. And also in terms of the number of mixed farms we have here, so there's already a good mix of grass. The soil potential is there and it's already preserved. So look, as I said, the department's thinking at the moment is that we will continue with the crop diversification rules around the 2-crop and the 3-crop rules. So that's what we'll be looking at. As everyone has said here, we like the farmers using this, in particular the arable farmers using how they see it. I suppose there is some criticisms around at the moment, but look, we'd like everyone's views, and then if they have points to make, to submit them. In terms of GAEC 2, I suppose this is the new GAEC, so we're actually working with the GRC, which is the research arm of the European Commission, and working on a project with them in terms of, mapping these areas, defining in them. There is some leeway in terms of the implementation time around GAEC 2. It has to be, there's room there can be implemented from either 2020, 24, 25, given member states time to define and map these areas. So look, we're working with the JRC on that in terms of the requirements around it. the Commission published a paper on it, and they have indicated such things as non-conversion to arable, possible restriction on ploughing. So they're the types of things, but at the moment we haven't defined it. We haven't defined the areas. So when we do that, we'll have to let the farmers know, and we'll also be making them aware of the restrictions. I see a question there, Paul, in around GAEC 9 as well, and in terms of non-productive features. So again, I've been asked there, what are the non-productive features? So GAEC 9 is going to be very similar to the EFAs there that we have at the moment. So there's an EFA list of ecologically focused areas such as hedges, trees in a line, drains, buffer strips, field margins, land lying fallow. We're also looking at including possibly stone walls and ponds in that as well. So again, welcome people's views on, if they think they should be expanded out into other non-productive features. So hopefully, Paul, that answers some of the questions on that. Okay.
Okay, yeah, thanks, David. That's great. There were just pick up on a couple of other things. I know there were a couple of follow-up questions on eligibility and eligible hectare, which I might just come back to in a moment. But there was one or two earlier questions, I think, in relation to TAMS and on-farm investments in terms of what might be included or excluded, and particularly questions around dairy equipment inclusion or other areas for inclusion in TAMS. So I might ask my colleague Miriam Cadwell or Owen O'Brien, I think, are on the call. Could one of you maybe pick up on that question around what types of investments are likely to be included in TAMS? First of all, I suppose in terms of the way we've set out things at the moment, but also I suppose looking for other people's views on that issue as well.
Yeah, sure, Paul. I can. Sorry, Paul. I can take that if you want. I'm not sure. Yeah, you can hear me all right there. On the
fine,
dairy,
go ahead, Mary.
On the dairy investments, I suppose just to clarify, first of all, that all capital investment scheme measures will be available to all farmers from all sectors. Just to make that very clear. All of the things we've listed, nutrient management and storage, farm safety, all of those measures will be available to all farmers from all sectors. Additionally, the young farmer top-up will be available to qualified farmers from all areas. The list of investment items, of the individual investment items, is still being looked at. It's still being considered. We have general categories included, but at the moment we have, as people probably know, more than 350 investment items included under the various TAMS measures. We will probably be looking at, we have suggestions for all sorts of additional investments. So we have a huge body of work to do to look at all of those investment items. And the comments made are noted. I know we're here to listen to suggestions, and we're very happy to hear them. So we will look at that. There's another comment at that on the capital investments on new technology. Certainly, we're interested in looking at new investment items. I suppose going back to comments by Ted and other people previously, the focus is very much on environmental investments under the CAP strategic plan. So that will have to be borne in mind. I think that's all of the queries on capital investments, Paul, unless there's something I've missed.
No, I think that was it. That's I think the extent of what I saw on the questions coming in, Miriam. I think that. Thanks very much for that. I might just come back on a couple of the comments that were made, or follow-up comments on eligible hectare. Maybe I might ask Thomas to come back in. I'm not sure, Thomas, if you've seen those couple of additional questions that come in, but there were a couple around, for instance, draining of wetland. If a farmer drained wetland enough to carry livestock, would that then be deemed ineligible or eligible, I think? Also, if eligible area was increased with the allowances for scrub, would that mean that payment would be redistributed over the larger area? And also there was a question, I think, or a comment around some of the positive changes that we're talking about there around eligibility, but also a question about small areas of wetland, whether they might be environmentally positive and considered also as, if you like, eligible area as well. So do you want to comment on any of those?
Yeah, so I'll cover those. I think there's one or two others here I see as well that I might just touch on. So the query there regarding to the increase in eligible area, what impact it will have. So it will have no, for most farmers, it would have no direct impact on their BIS, because the number of entitlements held won't change. The increase that might come about, so again, references 30% and areas of scrub, if that does lead to an increase in the eligible area, potentially that may lead to an increase in an eco-scheme payment, or for certain farmers, there may be potential for payments in some of the other schemes that were mentioned today. So BIS, probably not, unless a farmer was short land to cover his entitlements, to use that sort of language. But yeah, things like eco-scheme, there is a potential there for it. There's another question here, a very specific one, just to might touch on the receipt. There is former reps habitats go back in as eligible land. So they are a very particular set of old reps 4A habitats, and if a farmer has a former reps habitat, it is possible for them to go back in, but the normal, let's call them, rules of eligibility would apply to those areas with regard to the new BIS. That would mean things, for example, like the amount of scrub. There must be an agricultural activity on those areas, but yeah, there is scope for those areas to come back in. In terms then, I think there's another question asked about small areas of maybe wetlands and their role. I suppose I go back to my sort of starting point, just the fundamentals of eligibility are still the same. An agricultural area that has an activity was eligible and remains eligible. So to apply that to wetland, if you want to call it, land may go through periods of it being difficult to use and graze with livestock, but if it is possible for and the land is being used, then that land can be deemed currently eligible and could in the new one, then the new scheme, the new BIS. The difficulty arises where that land is so wet, it is not possible to use it. So in no normal year, it is possible to use the land for agriculture or maintain the land by mechanical or livestock means. Then those areas wouldn't meet the let's call it the normal definition of eligibility. So it all depends on the type of wetland, I suppose. But let's call it the very extreme versions of where it's not possible to graze, then that they're more difficult to see where they would fit in. So there's another question here, which again I just see coming in there, which is regards to scrub, and probably touches on what I mentioned already, but will it dilute the entitlement value? So it won't. The number of entitlements a farmer or an applicant holds will remain the same. It will, as I've already outlined, just maybe give a buffer, or perhaps give extra area that could be potentially available for things like the eco scheme that we touched on, or perhaps some of the other schemes that have been mentioned today. Okay. The question now, again, that you mentioned already there, Paul, if a farmer has drained wetland enough to carry livestock, would that be deemed ineligible or eligible? So I suppose, and this goes for a lot of the questions we're answering tonight, I'm very particular with eligibility. There isn't, it's important to say that no problem will give answers, but the very particular circumstances that might apply may need your FAS advisor or your advisor to go out on the ground. But so I'll answer it as I read it here. But if we talk about draining wetland, there's a few things that come into mind there. If that drainage is so extensive, things like environmental impact assessments might come into play. If that land is designated land, that might be an ARC, so it might require consent. But if that is just, to use different language, if it is just land that maybe was drained in the past and it needs, let's call it maintenance to make it more usable, then that type of maintenance activity, or let's call it drainage work on agricultural land, that is not going to impact eligibility. But I suppose the point I was making, and what's there in the regulations, is taking what is definitely non-agricultural land, for example, and carrying out large-scale improvements to convert it to agricultural land. In principle, that land itself can't be presented as eligible land under the new BIS. But my starting comments, individual case and looking at would be important, but that's the general principles there. Sorry, 1 second there now. Let's move on to the questions here. You know, so so again, the questions again, same about the idea of this increase in eligibility, whether it'll impact on the payment. It won't create any change in the number of entitlements, but again, that idea may have scope for eco schemes or operate a buffer. And to say it, I know, but it's no harm to repeat it. These are proposals we need to put to DG Agri as well. So there is obviously you know, possibility for them to want to at least discuss them or maybe suggest amendments or changes. So just to move on then again, so look, I suppose some of these are more comments about it, and I suppose just to make the general statement, we're clear that, you know, we want to pay on an agricultural area with an agricultural activity. It's fundamentally these schemes are for let's call it farmland, but we obviously want to recognise the important role that scrub and other areas have. So we do want to, and that's where I suppose these changes are coming from, and the idea that the thinking behind making these changes. Yeah, look, I touched on it already, but the specific one here about the small areas of wetland maybe, and again, and I'm doing, I know tonight we're using I'm using language loosely, but wetlands, it would depend on the type, whether it's just a small area of temporary wetness, but it can be grazed for maybe the summer months, or callow type situations, like, so there is an opportunity most years to go in and maybe cut hay or something like that. Those type of land, fine. The every second year agricultural activity change that I've mentioned and we're proposing, that would have, I think, that would fit into the callows might be a good example of that, where it's not possible one year to cut for very obvious practical reasons. The river is up, Shannon is up, for example, so we don't want farmers feeling like they have to go in or else they have problems with eligibility, and that would be a practical example of maybe where maintenance in a particular year would not cause issues with the eligible hectare and hence payments. Sorry, now I just make sure I've covered all of them here. So yeah, so there's in terms of the practicalities of the 30% rule, I'm being asked here, but how will it actually work? So some of this we do need to discuss with DG Agri, so we need to bring it, but the idea would be that within a parcel, so you'd be all familiar from years of the maps that we send out, so within those reference parcels, we call them, that up to 30% of that area, whether that be scattered scrub throughout the parcel, or maybe there might be an area, a dedicated area of, we call it, let's say 100% scrub in the corner, but as long as that's less than 30% of the total area of the parcel, we would not make any reductions in the eligible area. So the practical example would be a 10 hectare parcel, 2 hectares of scrub. We'd be saying that that actually would still get paid on 10 hectares, or the eligible hectare would be 10. You know, at the end of the day, once something meets the definition of an eligible hectare, it becomes available to draw down the various area-based payments. But the other part of the question here is asking, is there any difference in payment rates? No, once something meets the definition of eligible hectare, it can be then applied on and can be used by the applicant to draw down the various area-based payments that have been covered and mentioned today. Okay, sorry, now I'm just going on to the last one here. Okay, I think, guys, now that has covered, and I hope I've covered all the ones that I've asked. If others come in, there's no problem addressing them. But like I suppose we're saying, if there are any other queries, keep them. You can come into us at the email address, or if there's any others before the end of it, I'm happy to come back and address them there. I think that's all of them for the moment, Paul.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that, Thomas. That was very comprehensive. Appreciate that. So the next couple of points, just a couple of remaining points, I think that I wanted to come to. There were a couple of questions related to organics, which I think came up on the chat a little earlier. I've just lost my list here, just in front of me. My little window with questions has hung on me, so I can't go back to pick up on them. But I think colleagues may have them there. I'm not sure, Kevin, you may have seen those questions come through. I'm not sure, or maybe if somebody else might be able to just mention the couple of issues that came up on organics earlier on from some of the questions that came in from contributors, that'd be useful. Kevin, I don't know if you saw those earlier on, did you?
Yes, Paul. Yeah, I've seen some of those questions. So some of the questions there was one on why is there a minimum stocking density for organic farming scheme. So under the current scheme, there is a minimum stocking rate of 32.5 kgs of nitrogen per hectare per annum, and as declared on the BPS application. So this is an extensive stocking rate and is equivalent to a half a suckler cow per hectare, or put simply, a suckler cow per 2 hectares. So it's a very extensive stocking rate. Now, farmers not reaching that particular level will receive a pro rata payment to their level of production. And the main reason for the minimum stocking rate requirement is to ensure that there is adequate grassland management, and also to ensure a minimum level of organic production to satisfy organic supply chain requirements, thus meeting consumer demands. It has to be noted, though, that most organic farmers in the current setup would meet the stocking rate requirements, and them stocking rate requirements are being reviewed in the context of the new OFS commencing in 2023, and we will certainly take on board any comments that anyone would have on this, and in particular on such designated lands that perhaps may not be able to hold that stocking level. Another question that came there was how will the new OFS differ from the current one? Well, again, it is proposed to be a 5-year scheme, similar to one that's in place at the moment. A 2-year conversion period, and then a 3 years maintenance. Again, there will be more attractive payments to compensate for income forgone and the costs associated with conversion. So they will be built into the system. But simply, to qualify for the organic farming scheme, you must be registered with an organic control body. So you register with the body and have an organic license in place on the date of application. So in that regard, it's a simple process and similar to what exists at the moment. There was just another question regarding how will priority access for organic farming in the AECM work in practice? And just on that basis, currently a registered organic farmer did qualify for priority access in the GLOS under the current RDP. So by selecting actions that were appropriate to their farm. So it is proposed that this will again be the case for the new AECM, and it is envisaged that farmers who wish to avail of such priority access will be required to state when they're applying for the AECM that they're registered with one of the certification bodies, and then when we confirm that registration, the farmer will be accepted into the scheme, subject of course to satisfying the eligibility requirements and any intake limits that may be applicable at that time. Of course, at this stage, we wouldn't know the budget that will be available to it, but so Paul, they're the range of questions that I have seen. I don't know, is there anything else there? Thank you.
No, I think that was it, Kevin. I think that covers all of the questions that came up earlier. Sorry, I just wasn't able to scroll back through them before I passed over to you, but I think that that covers all of them. Thanks very much for that. I was going to just to pick up on one or two more points before we come to a few questions that we were going to put in a kind of a polling format to participants here tonight. So If people can hang on, I know we're getting close to 9 o'clock, but if those who are online at the moment could hang on, we have a series of questions which we've essentially extracted from the consultation document, and we might just give you a brief opportunity to respond to those questions in a polling exercise shortly. So if you can remain with us for a few minutes, that would be appreciated. But just a couple of other points that were made, and I'll ask colleagues also if they wish to add anything maybe before we get to the polling questions, if I've left anything out. But there was a question on gender and gender balance within the CAP strategic plan as well. I think a couple of questions there, one more specifically on KT and involvement of female KT groups, but also I think just a general question around what the department might do in relation to encouraging female participation and gender balance more generally. So look, I think on that question, we have an open mind again on this, and it is something we want to encourage. It is included in the objectives of the CAP in an overall sense that we include that, the gender balance is reflected in the design of CAP strategic plans. We do want to ensure that that is reflected in our own CAP strategic plan. And there are different ways of doing that. You can do that through obviously leaving as open as possible the conditions for participation in schemes and being as flexible as possible in our conditions in relation to established schemes that we have already, for instance, in the current plan or in the next plan that's coming along. So we can do it through that, or we could think about maybe a specific intervention to incentivize gender equality. We have included that as a question in the public consultation document, and it is one of the questions that we'll have in our poll shortly. So I suppose from our perspective, it is an open question to people as part of the consultation. Should there be a specific intervention? What do you think a specific intervention to incentivize gender equality or gender balance would look like? And we are open to your views on that. So again, that can be around a general, maybe more specific intervention, or around maybe how we would structure our schemes in a more systematic way to encourage participation from everybody in a gender balanced way. So that is an open question, and we are looking for contributions on that as part of the consultation exercise. So again, we haven't taken a particular view on that. We are asking people to give us their views on how we might achieve that. So that was on that. And I think, again, much just to make the more general point, I know there have been a number of comments, essentially, I think they've come through on the over the course of the webinar this evening. Again, more commentary, I think, rather than specific questions that we would respond to. And I think we just probably wouldn't have the time to get around to responding to all of those comments in the time that we have. But again, we will take those on board in the context of inputs to the consultation process. And again, as I said previously, we very much welcome your follow-up on those comments in terms of formal submissions to us through the CAP strategic plan email address, or in writing by post to the address that's outlined in the consultation document. So please do follow up on your comments with more substantial written submissions as well. So I think they were just looking again at the latest questions that come in. I think we've responded pretty much to all of the questions that have been recorded on the web, on the webinar format. So I'm going to move in a moment to asking a couple of the polling questions that we've set up to put to you, as I mentioned a moment ago. But I'm not sure if colleagues, just maybe to give a last opportunity to other colleagues from the department, is there anything that I've missed or they've missed, or anything that people want to add before I move to the polling questions? Val has her hand up. Val, would you want to?
Sorry, I put my hand up manually. I couldn't find the electronic mechanism for doing that in the webinar. There's just a couple of things that I'd like to kind of just clarify in relation to the Suckler scheme, if I can, just really quickly. Just in relation to the necessity for QAS membership, particular to that scheme. So this is a carbon measurement scheme. The core element of it is carbon footprinting. And currently that's done through the Borbia SBAS sustainability survey. And that is kind of, it's a fundamental thing that underpins that scheme. So that's just to kind of impress why that's important for that scheme, which I didn't cover earlier. The other thing that's important to note, one of the changes in this scheme in relation to the BDGP is that the clawback mechanism for animals that are disposed of and not replaced has been removed from this. So farmers won't be penalised for reducing their herd during the course of the contract if that's what they want to do. I did get one or two other questions just in relation to new entrants. And I suppose in addition to having to finalise how the reference period will work, the handling of new entrants we realise will have to be different, obviously, in terms of how they're handled for the tolerance levels, for the reduction, for the capping, and for their reference period. So that's something that we're very interested in getting people's views on how that might look. So those are just the kind of final points I'd like to make on that. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Val. Fran, you want to come in again there?
Yes, Paul, we've received a few questions around capping of direct payments. So I thought it might be useful just to run through that for everybody, because this is something that we absolutely want your opinion on. So capping is voluntary for member states to implement. If a member state implements it, they must cap all of the BIS payment and only the BIS payment over €100,000. They then, if they wish, can move on to a more stringent form of capping, and they can cap, a member state can cap the amount of BIS payment between 60 and 100,000 by up to 85%. It could be 50%, could be 70%, anywhere up to 85%. If Ireland implemented that capping at the most stringent form, or the maximum form, the BIS payment would be limited to 66,000 or thereabouts. And there is the option to deduct salaries and so on, but of course there are both admin problems and you know, from a farmer's side, farmers' problems in supplying that kind of information if that was to be taken into account. That will apply to anybody holding entitlements. So if you hold entitlements, maybe because you've rented in a lot of land, that capping would apply to you. So I suppose something we'd be keen to hear your thoughts on is whether you would consider capping at the most stringent form, capping the BIS payment at 66,000 is what you favour, or if you prefer a much more higher level up to 100,000. The other question that came in on that is what amount of money might that release? So if you have a look at the modelling, when we were preparing this document, the capping regime was somewhat different than what was actually agreed at the council at the end of June. So the modelling is based on actually slightly out of date material. But when we went back to look at this again, we just did not have time to be able to pull all of the information together on that capping regime I've just outlined to you. We see that the same number of people are affected. So it's a relatively small number of farmers, and the amount that capping, even at the maximum level, would generate is relatively low, somewhere between 1 and 2.5 million, depending on all of the other things in the direct payments. So the amount of convergence and the amount to go to eco schemes and front loading and so on. So it varies quite a bit what model might be looked at in that. And that information is all there in the modelling document. So I just wanted to say that because there have been a few questions around capping. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, thanks for that, Fran.